Da, 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 da. You're talking about Star Wars.
So I'm appreciating the ever evolving and changing theme. I think that's working for
I
us.
think it's ideal.
Yeah, because fuck a bunch of music.
I'm not. Anytime I listen to a podcast, I'm not there for music. You know
Unless
I mean?
you're listening to a podcast about music.
I don't listen to podcasts about music.
You
I'm
don't?
Rocko Jerome,
I'm Jeremy Hicks.
and this is the Penultimate podcast. And you got to talk about Star Wars sooner or later.
You know, I was surprised when I came in. We hadn't seen each other in a couple weeks. Like I said a couple episodes ago, it had been a while since we gotten together and done this. And so we're making conversation early on, and one of the first questions I asked was, "Have you seen the new Star Wars yet?" And you were just like, "No," and left it at that. And I'm curious, can you explain more about that? Because I actually assumed you would have went and had seen it last night.
Absolutely not.
So you have no interest in this?
No, not at all. I am free of Star Wars.
So
As a new thing, I am free of Star Wars.
So we're going to introduce a new segment that we're calling "Let's Get Cynical."
I mean, all right. So all right. Let's roll back the clock.
Okay.
Let's start that as that's like the murder scene at the beginning of the movie, and now we're going to tell you how the guy got killed. Right?
All right. This is very noir of us.
Sure. So Star Wars is a big deal. By the way, this might be a two-parter. We're going to look at the time and see how long it takes us to get through this. And okay. So,
we've been here since Thursday.
Yeah, right. And
so it's all good.
Today is Sunday.
Is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how long we've been here. I don't even know.
We do these, man. We do them. So I grew up with Star Wars, like anybody else our age. I was born in. I always say Star Wars came out in '77. I came out in '78. I was there in time for the Kenner toys. Major part of my childhood, right?
Same here.
And I think one of the things about Star Wars for people our age is that it revisits well, right? The original 3 Star Wars movies. They managed to age well. Like you can go back and try to watch He-Man or G.I. Joe or Transformers or whatever, and they might have a certain amount of charm, the other things that were sort of the genre entertainment from when we were kids, but they didn't have this sort of cachet of Star Wars, where it still works on a lot of levels. And it was designed to appeal to adults as well as children, right? Would you agree with that?
I would.
Yeah. So Star Wars for me was always a big deal. And you can now get a book from Sequart called A More Civilized Age that I wrote an article about that period of time between 1984 and about 1997 when only really big fans still cared about Star Wars.
Yeah, so I was going to mention this. Tell us briefly, real quick, about what the story is with this book and how you came to be a part of it.
Well, it's a group called Sequart, which stands for Sequential Art. They're guys who have a website, and they've done a series of different books about comics primarily and other genre entertainment, where they look at it as sort of a heightened idea. It's sort of, they approach it as an art form, as a form of literature, and they have a very serious-minded series of discussions about these types of things. So I'm very glad to be a part of it because it's the kind of thing that appeals to me. And they've, I mean, just like we're doing here, they finally had to get around to Star Wars. So they did a series of books that are done by, the editors are a guy named Rich Handley and a guy named Joe Baronato, who are both friends of mine. And I was involved in the first one, and I'm now involved in the third one, which theoretically this will be the end. But just like many things with Star Wars, it's probably not actually ever going to be the end. So I'm very glad to be involved in that.
Are these guys local?
Mm-mm. No, Rich worked for Lucasfilm in some capacity for a lot of years, and Joe is involved in a lot of different literature pursuits, and I forget where Rich is.
That's cool.
Yeah. So it's good to be involved in those. Really important to me, even when it wasn't really supposed to be. And I was always really happy with the fact that I could revisit it and find it to still be good and still have things to offer. And it was always something that was good to be excited about. When you met somebody who was as big a Star Wars fan as you, it was a special thing. And Star Wars was finite, and I always felt like that was part of what made it great, was that there wasn't a lot of Star Wars. There wasn't like an unending series of television shows. While there was always a lot of Star Wars products, and they were always intent on cashing in that sense, it didn't feel like they did that with the movies or the TV shows to any great extent. They had the cartoons and the special Ewoks movies and all that kind of stuff. But that wasn't really a big deal to me. So I was always had a warm feeling about it. It was a good thing in my life, and I think for like a lot of people, it sort of almost took on a sort of a religious level of significance for me.
I would agree that it was a big part of my childhood as well. I can't help but recall Yogurt explaining in Spaceballs about the that it was all about merchandising.
Uh-huh.
So I mean, growing up, of course, Star Wars this, Star Wars that.
Sure.
I had vinyl albums. I had the comforter. I had the clothes. I had the toys.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a big part of my childhood, and it's interesting that you talk about this period, sort of this lull in between Return of the Jedi and the Phantom Menace, because while there was not any new films, it still continued to be a part of my life. And eventually Dark Horse came to, some sort of agreement with Lucasfilms, and they began releasing comic books.
Right.
There were novelizations and
the Timothy Zahn book.
Yeah. So, I sort of, even though the films had gone away, I was vicariously living through other people, experiencing the expanded universe.
Right.
But at the same time, to me, the films were the beginning and the end. It would be cool to hear about some of these things, but I never really was into checking any of it out.
Sure.
And cynically, I'm glad I didn't, because when Disney purchased them, they purged all that. So I'm sure there's a lot of pissed off fans out there.
There are, yeah. And one of the things too about that I always put a lot of value on is that you had to go out and find these things. They weren't at Toys R Us. If you wanted to get the lead miniatures from the role-playing game, you had to go to a hobby store. If you were interested in how fast a TIE fighter was versus an X-Wing, you had to go find the books that explained that. And they had those.
Yeah.
It was all part of the role-playing game. And so you could go as deep into it as you wanted to. And one of the things about Star Wars, too, is the merchandising that you touched on. Before Star Wars, nobody had really quite hit it on all cylinders. And it was something that changed everything as far as merchandising goes. For kids in the era before that, you maybe would get toys based on something like Planet of the Apes, something like that. But it wouldn't be a whole lot of stuff. It wouldn't be comforters and this whole evolution of this insane degree of how every facet of your life can be Star Wars oriented now.
Like Star Wars, the flamethrower.
Yeah, like it just continues to just build and build and build. And the reason that it was like that was that Lucas wanted to have complete control of his movies. So he let the studio keep most of the money from the actual films themselves. And then he made his money on marketing, which he could see that the way that fandom was growing, there would be a market for these types of things. So that was something that I think kind of warped us in a very real way. If you were a kid who grew up in the 60s, you had to get a G.I. Joe. And G.I. Joe didn't have any sort of media tie-in. And there was rules against it back then. There was actual rules that said you couldn't have a TV show based on a toy because that will fuck kids up. Like, they knew then. They were aware of it. And those rules were eventually thrown away by Reagan, which is why in 1984 you suddenly had a huge just push on cartoons based on toys.
Absolutely, and it dominated our childhood.
Right. And it's something that still exists in our heads today, right? Like, you look for the tie-in. You look for the never-ending story, because there's always got to be the next fix. If you look at things from before Star Wars, way before Star Wars, they were finite. Sherlock Holmes eventually dies. The end of Frankenstein is the end of Frankenstein. That's it. The creator, who is known as the creator of the thing, decides when they're done, and the publishing company or whatever else can come and say, keep making more, but they're able to say, no, I don't want to. Okay. And that's the way that it works. Or at least that's the way that it used to work.
Yeah.
Now the name of the creator doesn't matter as much as the creation itself. And people tend to forget that there's anybody even driving the bus.
Well, I certainly haven't forgotten.
Me neither, my friends. Me neither. So, when they started to put the prequels out, and it was funny because there was this sort of episode 1 experience where everybody went to see it, and most people were disappointed, but a lot of people didn't allow themselves to feel the disappointment.
There was one of the guys I went and saw it with was a guy I went to high school with, and I distinctly remember him saying after we'd seen Phantom Menace that it was the best Star Wars movie he had ever seen.
Sure.
And I quickly was like, "What did I miss?"
Right.
You know, and I mean, you know, in hindsight, it's like, did he experience some sort of form of Star Wars PTSD?
Uh-huh.
I mean, just could he not?
There's a little bit of that.
You know, could he not accept the fact that this was a subpar film?
Right.
Yeah.
It's like a religion, Star Wars is, right? And there's people who are at different points in their journey with this type of thing. And you also have something where, you know, like we can sit here and talk about Captain Britain or Captain Marvel or what, you know, whatever, all these different sort of fandom things that have a very smaller piece of that pie. Now, to me, fandom has always kind of just been a pain in my ass once I kind of discovered that it existed. Because to me, this is all about my experience with these things.
Yeah.
When I'm in the movie theater, I'm not listening to anybody around me. When I'm reading a comic book, I'm just reading the comic book.
Yeah.
When we talk about it later, like if you're a lunatic about it, then you kind of, in a way, are taking a little bit of that away from me.
Well, I mean, the word fan is derived from fanatic.
Right.
And,
so right away.
And I mean, there's a difference between, to me, there's a difference between someone who's a fan of something and, you know, some people are just, I mean, they truly are fanatics.
Right. Just out of their minds about these things.
Yeah.
So, you know, Star Wars is massive. So you weren't allowed to just sort of go see the movie. Well, I mean, I guess you could, but it was difficult to just go see any of those prequels. Just appreciate them from what they are. Just say, you know, well, whatever. Like you had to pick everything apart. And those movies were never really designed for that. And the thing about Star Wars was, when George Lucas set out to make the thing, he was trying to make a new version of an old-time movie serial. He was trying to make the deal with those things like Flash Gordon or like Captain Marvel, which we talked about in previous installments, was that they were cheaply made, they were fun, they weren't made for anything but to amuse children, and most kids didn't see them from the beginning to the end. And the plot sometimes would be kind of rickety and all over the place, just by virtue of what they were. So he was trying to make something that was like a parody of that. He originally wanted to make Flash Gordon. He couldn't get the rights, so he did this instead. But going in, he didn't mean for this to be the biggest thing he would ever do. He thought it was just something that he would possibly get away with making, right? And he had a lot of artful ideas about it. He had a lot of influences of higher things. You know, he was really into Akira Kurosawa, of course.
Yeah. Hidden Fortress was influential on the original film.
Yeah, Joseph Campbell's hero sagas and the ideas of sort of the quintessential hero's quest. These were all things that were in his mind when he was doing this. And he had a lot of help in doing it from a lot of brilliant people. Brian De Palma helped him make this movie. Coppola, Steven Spielberg. When they were shooting the first movie, it was kind of a mess. And without his wife's help and editing, there may have never been a movie. Like
ex-wife.
Right, yeah, no, ex-wife. When you watch that movie and you know a lot of those things, there's barely a movie there. Like, they really got away with something.
Yeah.
And the movie coming out at the time that it did, when people had a certain fatigue about Vietnam, when science fiction had become very high-minded in most cases, to have something that was just for fun, it was pop art. And that was also the case in the next two, I felt. They were very finely made clocks. They took years to make, from conception to the end practice. And one thing that you could always say about Star Wars was that there was one guy who was ultimately in charge, right? So the way that I looked at the prequels was that it was almost like there was some old storyteller in our village who told wonderful stories. And he said, I'm going to tell you the end of the story eventually. And he wandered off. And then he came back many years later, and he'd been changed somehow by something. Who knows what happened? Maybe part of him got devoured by a bear. But he wasn't the same anymore. But he had these stories to tell, and he just kind of tried to pick out the best parts of it. It's like, well, okay, this is what he was going for. And I didn't wear my critic hat to any of those movies. I was just like, okay, well, this is part of this.
Yeah.
But my sense of equipoise was thrown way off by those. Like, I would argue with people on the internet, things that I'm no longer proud of. Actually, I wasn't proud at the time. I just wanted to enjoy Star Wars.
Yeah.
And I felt like it would be cool to enjoy it with other people. And it was very difficult to do that. But then out of that, you got the Phantom edit, where somebody went in and they edited the same way that his first movie had been edited down and made a much better movie out of the Phantom Menace, which was interesting. And to me, it just sort of meant like, hey, okay, this was disappointing. You had many years to make the movie up in your mind. You can still do that. You can still, like, I always sort of imagined, especially in the first time in Star Wars and Obi-Wan and Luke meet, it almost pictured like 40s looking guys as the Jedi. Like guys with like, tight comb over hairdos and like leather jackets flying around in jets, like space jets. Like, imagine sort of the Star Wars version of that. Because everything looked very 70s as far as their hair and stuff.
Yeah.
So I always had a very different picture in mind, and I think a lot of people did too, sort of what it would actually look like when we would get to prequel time. Well,
you've heard me say it before that in Lucas's defense, I think what he tried to accomplish with the prequel films was noble in the sense that he tried to create, something new.
Right.
He just happened to fail.
Yeah.
I mean, we could sit and go on all day about all the reasons why these films didn't work, but I still admire the fact that he tried to make something new, and people do not give him the credit that he deserves for that.
Right.
Now, I'll be honest with you, I'm relatively new to this line of thinking as well. It really took seeing the J.J. Abrams helmed The Force Awakens for me to appreciate what Lucas did, because to me, and I may be jumping ahead here, The Force Awakens is just derivative. I mean, it's essentially a New Hope again.
Right.
I heard a girl in the comic book store at the destination talk about she'd seen it like several times within a week's time when it came out, and she loved it, and it was like the greatest Star Wars movie ever.
Right.
And people fucking say that after every Star Wars movie. It's
do.
the greatest Star Wars movie ever.
They truly do that, yeah.
So it's again, I'm new to this line of thinking, but it took seeing the derivative, mess that Abrams created with The Force Awakens for me to appreciate the prequel films.
Right.
So I will give Lucas that.
Well, and something about the prequels also is that they are the biggest budget independent movies fathomable. That'll never happen again. I mean, it's Howard Hughes territory. You got a guy who's like so rich and so powerful. You know what he wanted to do with the prequels originally was the first one was going to be directed by Spielberg, the second was going to be Ron Howard, and the third was going to be Coppola.
I didn't know that.
Those guys are all friends of his, right?
Wow.
And they all three were like, no, we don't want to be the one to fuck up Star Wars. And probably also they don't want to work for Lucas, right? So a lot of the thing that you see when you watch the original Star Wars movies, and if you see like behind the scenes stuff on the first one especially,
Yeah.
was that everybody was like, fuck you, George. Faster, more intense. What does that even mean? What are you talking about? And like when he would say like, oh, yeah, this line, they'd all laugh at him. Carrie Fisher would make fun of him. Harrison Ford, Mark Hamill would do voices. Like they didn't take him seriously when he would direct them. And he was a bad director. He's not a good director of people, right? Plus, he's making movies that, again, are designed to be not necessarily a parody of, but to be in the grand tradition of very hammy, ham-fisted, fucked up and weird, kooky movie serials. Where it's like, there he is, get him!
Yeah.
Can we build the rocket? I'm not sure, Dale. Well, we've got to find a way off this planet. Like, that's the dialogue that they're going for. They're not going for anything but that. It's not supposed to sound like you and your friend ordering a cheeseburger. So, that was the case when he was making those movies. But then when he was making the prequels, you get going to work with a master. Right? So you get Ewan McGregor in a room with George Lucas, and George Lucas is like, sometimes I just think it's better when you just yell the lines. You know, like he doesn't fucking know. He doesn't know what he wants. He doesn't know how to talk to people. He's weird. That's just part of who he is.
Well, let me ask you this. If he had the insight to recognize that he was not cut out to direct Jedi, Empire, and he outsourced those, why didn't he just do that with Phantom Menace?
He wanted to. And the guy he wanted was Spielberg.
I mean, but he could have found other people.
He had 20 years to be weird about it.
He certainly did.
And that's what it is. He had 20 years to be weird about it, and he made something weird.
Now, remind me, has he directed anything since Revenge of the Sith?
Yeah, he made that Red Tails movie.
I didn't watch that.
I didn't either. I've had it. I've had enough. I've been through enough with this guy. But the thing was you look at like, you know, a guy like Coppola, you know, or Spielberg even. Like those guys got to make big movies and then keep going.
Yeah.
But Lucas made such a. I mean, it's like it's that kind of thing that happened to like Michael Jackson and Elvis, where they made something so big that it removed them from society. Lucas could no longer be among us, and he couldn't just make another movie.
Yeah.
At least he didn't feel like he could, I guess. And he tried, and he just couldn't get over that hump. You know, he was stuck in the genre film bubble, and it's like if it wasn't Star Wars, it wasn't working really. It was Howard the Duck. So, you know, the poor guy he painted himself into a corner. You know, I think it's one of those great American, like Gatsby-esque tragedies. It really is in a lot of weird ways.
I do not have a ton of sympathy for him, though I think that is a good analogy. I mean, it is very Gatsby-esque, I guess. But you know, I mean, I guess the thing that I have a difficult time reconciling is, and I did not take a lot of time to articulate this, so bear with me. But some of the things that part of what I struggle with as a Star Wars fan is other Star Wars fans. So
I hear you.
So that is a challenge for me at times.
Yeah.
But then
fandom in general, I have a hard time.
Yeah,
with.
yeah. The other thing, I guess, that I struggle with these films is my own expectations.
Sure.
And to be honest with you, as a middle-aged man, I think I need to work on my expectations in general. And so maybe this is, you know, maybe this is not the time or the place to get into that. But at the same time,
but maybe it is.
But at the same time, I mean, I think that I know I've certainly been disappointed with these last, with the prequel trilogy. I was disappointed with The Force Awakens. I thought Rogue One was all right, but it's like I need to seriously take the time, and I think a lot of people need to take the time to ask themselves what it is that they're so disappointed about, that they're not getting from these films,
right.
What these films mean to them in the first place, and what it is that they're missing. And we need to go and get that shit somewhere else.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah, and you can, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's one of those things where it's like, and this is the same thing we've touched upon in other episodes, is that you don't need Batman to turn into something about adulthood. The concept is a guy who puts on a bat suit and fights crime. It doesn't need to be that serious. You don't need to have the Joker raping and murdering and doing all these horrible things that they have him doing in the books. And I think it's exactly what you said. The thing that people seem to want from Star Wars isn't in Star Wars. Not if you want to see some sort of a really transcendent, life-changing experience from film. And those movies exist. But something about the quality of Star Wars has prevented people from outgrowing it, right? And I think that's unfortunate, is that people get stuck on it. And it used to be that, like, if you were a kid who grew up watching the Flash Gordon serials, and then years later you saw The Graduate, like, you could tell, like, people seem to want Star Wars to grow into something that it's just never going to grow into. You can't make a plant into a tree.
Yeah. I guess the other thing is that people need to, and again, this is probably just me projecting here, but just what is it about these films that we're drawn to in the first place?
Right.
So with you, with the original films, what is it that appealed to you?
Well, a lot of it at this point is nostalgia.
Okay.
To be honest,
South Park parodied nostalgia and Star Wars season before last. That was basically the entire season. Yeah. So I think that nostalgia can be detrimental.
Oh,
I think
certainly.
it can be very detrimental.
It most certainly can.
And you've heard me talk about how much I liked this last season of Twin Peaks,
right.
because it was anti-nostalgia for me, right. Because what they did was they took characters that we knew and we loved, and people's expectations of it completely flipped it on its head.
Right.
A lot of people hated it for that reason.
Yeah.
I loved it because, in the vein of some of these comic book characters that we've discussed, where they started out as one thing and they became something else. And a lot of times people lose their shit over that. But that's why I liked this last season of Twin Peaks.
Right. Well, and I think in a lot of cases, like, it all just sort of feels like fan fiction after a while. You know what I mean?
Like how so?
Well, I mean, like, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby did amazing things with Fantastic Four. And creators since then can go back and like sort of revisit elements and retell stories in slightly different ways. But what are they really doing with that? And you can say that of a lot of these things. And a lot of it goes into the marketability of these characters, right? Spider-Man is never going to get old and have a kid, right? And give up being Spider-Man, and the kid takes over.
Well, but interestingly enough, there's a series that explores that very aspect right
but
now.
It's a series that explores something. It's not going to be the actual Spider-Man comic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they got to keep making money off Spider-Man, right? So Spider-Man's always going to be Spider-Man because that's where the money is. And, you know, it's just one of those situations where capitalism has won out over everything. The reason that there's more Star Wars movies is corporate greed and fanboys who can't tell when they've had enough ice cream for one night.
I was I was saying this to someone recently. People are head over heels for this Disney acquisition of Fox.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, explain this to me. So you will get bent out of shape about corporate behemoths, conglomerates. You'll be like, I'm not shopping at Walmart. I'm not going here. I'm not doing that. How is it that suddenly, because it's entertainment, that it's okay?
Yeah.
It's not okay.
Yeah.
It's not fucking okay.
Yeah.
No.
And it's going to give you something that you think you want, but you don't want it.
Yeah, good luck. Good luck with that.
All these X-Men movies and X-Men universe, Deadpool and all.
Which all these Fox superhero movies are garbage anyway.
You don't like any of them?
Not especially, no.
I like Logan. I don't have any interest in Deadpool.
Yeah.
Logan was good. What I will challenge you on is, isn't it at least good that they're able to do something different from what the Disney-fied version is doing?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, now...
Even if you don't like the actual product, isn't it good? Because now what's going to happen is they're going to recast the X-Men, and it's going to be one of the Marvel movies.
Yeah.
You're not going to have any cursing. You're not going to have any adult content. You're not going to have any of that. It's going to be gone.
No, I think you bring up a very valid point, and I absolutely agree with you. So I guess the cat's out of the bag. I'm not going to hold back on how I feel about these superhero movies, calling the Fox films garbage. I tried to somewhat have a filter the last time we talked about this stuff, but fuck it.
I think it's good that we do these all in a row because it gets later and our skin gets thinner and we.
So again, you bring up a great point that. Yes, while I was not a fan of them, they were at least different. Moving forward, these are all going to be cookie cutter. They're all going to be the same.
Absolutely.
Disney,
made by a committee.
Disney has their formula,
Sure.
and they're going to apply that to all of these characters. Yeah. If I was, there's already been talk of, okay, what does an R-rated Deadpool 2 mean now owned by Disney? I don't see how it happens.
Right. Yeah, it's over.
Yeah.
Because they need to sell more toys. Because they need to make as much money as possible. Inside 10 years, Star Wars is going to be part of it. I think they're just going to make it all one thing.
It's going to be like Imagination Land from South Park.
They're going to just cram it all together. Right? They're going to figure out a way to put Mulan in there. And people are going to go with it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean... People are. I do not understand. I do not understand a lot of these nerds. I really don't. People just they love these Marvel movies, and we politely compared it to fast food last time.
Sure.
I mean, I just think it's just shit.
Yeah.
I really don't understand why these movies are so beloved. Nobody's going to give a fuck about these movies in 20 years.
No, I mean, yeah, exactly. Because I don't feel like there's any sort of an emphasis on art. There's nothing about it's artfully done.
Yeah.
So, once I heard that Star Wars, and it's funny because, obviously a lot has happened in the last year's time. And it no longer seems quite as important anymore what happens with Star Wars, given that it feels like the state of the world is in constant peril. So maybe that's helped me to not be so concerned about what's going on with Star Wars movies in the last couple of years. But when it was first announced that, it was going to be Episode 7, and it was obvious if they got Harrison Ford that he was going to have Han Solo killed.
Yeah.
And he went on a series of talk shows and broke expensive Han Solo toys. He did that. He did that with a Lego Millennium Falcon on Jimmy Kimmel or one of them, and then the next night he did the same thing with a Hot Toys thing on Conan O'Brien. It was like his thing. He was gleefully destroying Star Wars. And I always said if he had gotten his way and Han Solo had died in Return of the Jedi, I would have turned out differently. I really think so.
How so?
Well, Empire Strikes Back, when we saw it in the theater, and we saw it on one of the re-releases right before Return of the Jedi. I figured this out just from how old I had to have been. It was traumatic for me because Luke and Han and Leia and Lando, that was John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Those were extremely important characters to me. So Han was in peril. Luke gets his hand cut off. It's heavy, right?
Yeah.
It's for a kid, but it's not too heavy that it blows a kid apart. Like, I still don't know what happens in Bambi after his mom dies. That's a lot of shit to lay on a kid.
Or Transformers the movie.
Yeah, I mean, that's another one. We'll have to talk about that another time. But
Yeah.
they had no idea how much that character meant to kids. I always say that our generation's JFK was Optimus Prime. That's how good we had it, right? So, Empire was heavy. So then when I saw Jedi, Han Solo was a big deal for me. He's still he was always sort of my style icon. Still kind of is. The idea of having a personal uniform where you wear certain things and it's sort of like everybody says Han Solo always wore the same thing. He didn't.
Yeah.
He wore totally different things in each episode if you're paying attention. But he certain diaphragm. It was all in a certain area of things that he would wear. So anyway, I feel like Return of the Jedi was heavy enough. I mean, the main powerful death element is Vader, right? And Star Wars is just not the movie where everybody dies, where that many people die in a horrible way. That's Aliens. You can have other stuff for that. Star Wars isn't that. Star Wars it's like a fairy tale. It's a kids movie. It really is. It's a well above average kids movie.
Are we talking about A New Hope?
All three of the original movies.
Okay.
I really believe that. So, if Han had died, that would have been hard on me. I think I may have lost interest in genre entertainment. I would have just been like, I can't deal with this.
Really?
Yeah, I was a little kid, and Han Solo was a really big deal for me. Right? And he had an arc, which is something that I don't think Harrison Ford even completely understood. At the end of at the beginning of Star Wars, he has no real friends.
Yeah.
Chewie is with him because he has to be.
Right.
Right? And he doesn't know what friends are. Not really. And he makes friends, and he falls in love with this woman, and he decides to quit being who he was. And then at the beginning, or wherever point of the episode 7...
The Force Awakens.
The Force Awakens. He's fallen back into being the guy that he was at the beginning of the first movie.
I actually thought that was appropriate.
I didn't like it.
You didn't like it?
Didn't like it at all.
No, I mean, I think you could make the argument that people never change.
Yeah, but I don't think that's Star Wars. I think the argument that people never change is maybe valid for another movie, another series of movies, something else, but not this.
Yeah.
In this movie, it really was insulting to me that everybody's life turned to shit and it wasn't worth showing in a movie. We got to get the minority character over. We got to get the girl over. We got to get the character who is gay, but we don't want to come out and say he's gay over. That was like their thing that they felt like they needed to do. Let me stop before that soundbite gets me in trouble. I believe in those things. I think it's very important, and I think it is good that girls and minorities, whatever, have characters like this that are important. But it was very clear that it was part of a mandate.
Oh, sure. And people have accused Marvel Comics of something similar.
Sure.
And I think in some cases it works, and in some cases it doesn't work.
Yeah.
What I was going to say was that if I'm reading between the lines here, it sounds like what you're saying, and if it is in fact what you're saying, I agree with, that I think it would have been much more interesting to have seen these people's lives fall apart over the course of a film or two.
Better that than just have it start off with new characters who are new, young, hot actors and actresses who they can sign to lifetime fucking contracts so they can make toys of them forever and make it about getting these characters over and say, again, Han, Luke, Leia, and Lando are John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Those are the main characters. And to not even fucking show Lando, never even mentioned him, it's just bullshit.
Yeah.
And just start off with these characters thrown to the four winds. It's just not true to the former story. In professional wrestling, there's a thing called getting someone over, right? That's like backstage parlance. So if you and I are going to have a wrestling match, and let's say I'm The Rock and you're some new guy, right? And I'm The Rock. I'm a badass. So we're going to have a match, but we got to put you over. We want the fans to start cheering for you and not me because I got to go.
Yeah.
Right? So we're going to have a match, and you're going to beat the shit out of me. And I'm going to fall down even though you've never seen me fall down like that before because you're so badass. And that's called putting you over, right? And they did that with all the characters. And they got Harrison Ford, of all people, to come out and do it. Right? He gets killed by the guy to make you hate him.
Yeah.
Right? And he's killed in such a way that he's basically just disposed of. You know, people were like, oh, you just don't like because Han died. And I had a lot of time to think about it. It's like, if they had killed him in a way... You didn't see the new Guardians of the Galaxy, did you?
Volume 2?
Yeah.
No.
You probably don't care about it.
No.
Okay, good, because I'm going to do a spoiler here.
I'm cool with that.
There's a character named Yondu who's like the father figure. That may have been the case in the comics. I know that you like those comics. But Yondu is killed. And Yondu is killed, and then they, for the next 20 or 30 minutes, that's what the movie is about, is his son kind of like moving through it and figuring it out. And Yondu is a secondary character. Like, he's not on the fucking poster of the first one. Like, he's really not a big character. And they did that with him. And they told the story pretty well for the kind of entertainment it is.
Yeah.
And Han Solo just gets flushed down the fucking toilet and he's immediately forgotten about. He's one of the most beloved characters in all of pop culture. And it doesn't work for me. And, you know, before that he's like, this kid is funny, you know, or like, why don't you come work for me on the Millennium Falcon? Things that are totally out of character for this guy. And the stories that have been established that live inside of all of our hearts. So I found it offensive. You know, it was very obvious to me what they were doing. And it's hard to not be cynical about that. It just felt very manipulative.
No, and you know, we made it clear at the beginning of the episode that it was time to get cynical.
Yeah.
So, you know,
I mean, I prefer to just think of it as pragmatic, honestly.
For me, I guess, you know, with The Force Awakens, you know, I've already made it clear. I feel like it's derivative and is essentially A New Hope all over again.
Everything you're saying. Yeah.
Something that I find frustrating about these Star Wars movies, and I guess the obviously we spoil the shit out of stuff on here. So, you know, I mean, I guess with that said, one of the things that I liked about Rogue One was the fact that everybody died.
Yeah, I didn't see it.
Okay, well.
Yeah, I don't care.
Did you already know that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. All right,
I mean, these things are like osmosis, man. Like,
Yeah.
if you're in the geek world at all, like if you like comics and you go to a place to buy them,
yeah,
like you're going to hear everything about all this stuff.
yeah,
But I like for it to just be something I heard about, right?
yeah.
And the reason that I didn't want to see that movie was that when I saw the trailers, it didn't feel like Star Wars to me. The dialogue didn't sound like that. There he is, get him kind of dialogue.
See, that's actually why I was drawn to it, because after watching The Force Awakens, and The Force Awakens so desperately wanted to be, you know, A New Hope.
But it seemed comically so. Like, there's like scenes where it feels like the Office version of Star Wars.
You're talking about in
The Force Awakens.
The Force Awakens?
Yeah. Like at the beginning when they bring the guy before the main villain, and he's like, do I talk or do you talk? So they immediately start to make the villain look like an idiot.
Yeah. So anyway, Rogue One, the reason that I liked Rogue One was because it tried to not be like the other 7 Star Wars films.
Right.
And I think if this franchise wants to continue and wants to have success, they're going to have to make Star Wars films that are not carbon copies of Star Wars films.
Right.
So that's why I'll be interested to see how The Last Jedi turns out. I've heard great things.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see if it is yet another failed continuation of trying to capture something that, you know, is, you know, that lightning in a bottle that can't be captured again.
Right, sure.
Or if it tries to stand on its own. And if it tries to stand on its own, I think I'll appreciate that and respect that, like I did with the prequel films to a certain extent.
Right.
More so than it just being The Empire Strikes Back Part 2.
Sure. Well, I mean, here's where we can maybe, in my case, get a little bit less cynical. Was that, you know, when I nowhere near the level of fanatical fan that I am, she loved it. She was like, you just hate everything. He's man. And that was sort of the way that conversation went. And it was like, you know what? If you like it, good for you. Okay? If kids see this and it speaks to them, I just consider myself very fortunate that I had what, in my appraisal, was much more original and much more interesting stuff to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sit here and just pick on
Right.
Star Wars for being derivative,
Yeah.
for being, nostalgic.
Sure.
Unfortunately, we're inundated with that all the time.
all
So
the
it's not just Star Wars that's guilty of it. Again, and this is where expectations come into play. I have rightfully, wrongfully, the expectations that that The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi not play into that.
Right.
Unfortunately, The Force Awakens did.
That's what it says for you.
My hope is that The Last Jedi does not.
I mean, I'm just cashed out. My way of doing it was like, as I was going to see The Force Awakens, I was like, I feel like I'm going to a funeral. I don't want to watch this. But I was already locked in. I was there with my girlfriend at the time with the fucking the 3D glasses and all that shit.
Yeah.
And it's like, I just got to sit here and have this fucking happen to me and go through this. And like, I didn't even want to, And I don't want to anymore. And at first it was kind of difficult, and like I had to have some tough conversation with my friends and just be like, why is this okay with you? How are you okay with this? Why is this just okay? Do you not realize that this is just the beginning and there's going to be a new one of these every 9 months from now on? How does that seem appealing to you? Do you really want to have this much more ice cream? Don't you know you've had enough ice cream? You're going to get sick. And, after a while, it was, and just the hits of life coming, but it was just like, I'm just going to let this go. And now it's just like a million other things that I don't really fucking care about, I love Spider-Man. I don't care to pick up a Spider-Man comic right now, but I can always go back and read the classic Stan Lee, John Romita comics.
Just like you can always go back and watch the original Star Wars films and just, put the prequels, put The Force Awakens out of your mind.
And that's where I'm at, man.
And that's the way it should be.
I chased down the last Kenner figures that I could still afford. And I have a Facebook group called Star Wars Original Trilogy Fans. And that's all the Star Wars I think about. And really, I mean, it's not healthy to fucking dwell on Star Wars as much. And there's so many other things that are coming out that are great, that deserve our attention.
Well, I can't remember.
I saw a lot of good movies this year.
Yeah. I think we talked about it in one of our first episodes that I'd covered the Transformers convention,
right?
And I sort of, my opening for all these people was, "What's your favorite Transformer?"
Sure.
Then there was that one guy who was like, "Well, let me tell you about my least favorite Transformer."
Right.
I appreciate that you have recognized that you have become that guy when it comes to Star Wars, and you have decided, no, this is not who I am.
I'm just not going to do it. And I mean, I have friends that try to badger me into it, and kind of like bait me and stuff. And it's like, you know what? No, I'm not going to play into your stereotype.
Yeah.
I'm not interested. It's not for me.
Speaking of the original film, something that I thought was interesting, and I started thinking about this when you and I bumped into each other at the destination 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
We had decided that we were going to talk about Star Wars. Again, you went to your corner, I went to mine. We came together. A lot of times we don't know where it's going to go, what it's going to be about.
Yeah, we're still in the early phases of this podcast and figuring out what we're doing here.
But one of the things that I mentioned in passing was all the different changes that had been made to the original film over the years.
Right.
So I looked into it before we got together.
Which is the early signs of George Lucas's debilitating OCD.
I mean, it is certainly strange to me.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is. And so depending on what you consider an alteration, by my count, for just the first film, I see 10 different changes alone.
Right. Over the years,
beginning in 1985.
Yeah.
Some say as early.
Earlier than that, I think. Really.
What you know what?
Because they changed it because the original one did not say A New Hope episode anything.
Yeah.
It just said Star Wars.
You know what? You're right. It's actually as early as
like 78, 77 maybe.
I believe you may be right.
Yeah.
Because that was when I guess he went back and he changed the crawl to include A New Hope.
They took out a lot of references to Biggs because he just yelling about Biggs all the time, and Biggs wasn't in the movie anymore.
Yeah. You're talking about Biggs Darklighter. They removed the scene of I don't think this was included in the original theatrical release, but where Biggs Darklighter was on Yavin 4 talking with Luke.
That is not in that version. But there's still scenes where Luke says, like, Biggs is right. I'm never going to get off this planet.
Yeah.
And it's like, who the fuck is Biggs? And then, like, during the final trench thing, Sparrow's like, Biggs, get out of there! And Biggs gets killed. It's like Biggs is like his imaginary friend. And again, the movie wasn't designed to be watched over and over again.
Well, they added that in the special edition in 97 to sort of give it that emotional effect that he felt was lacking after removing it in the initial.
But before he did that, he just took out all references to Biggs. See, he went back and forth with it.
Wow.
When I look at George Lucas and his behavior with Star Wars over the years, with going back and putting stuff in and taking this and doing that and making these prequels and making them the way that he made them and being all freaked out all the time, I feel like Star Wars is a manifestation of this man's illness. I really believe that.
Well, I guess the thing that what would cement it for me if I felt, if I felt like that were true, would be he would have never had sold it in the first place.
I think he sold it to try to be free of it.
Yeah. I
think he could either kill himself or sell Star Wars. I honestly believe that.
Well,
I'm not smiling when I say that.
Well, I thought it was interesting whenever The Force Awakens was released. Of course, people wanted to know what Luke thought about it, and he was just like a total dick about the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it was like, really, man? You can't let this thing go after selling it, making all this money? It's like he still can't let it go.
Well, he can't. He's nuts. And this if he wasn't already crazy, Star Wars and the success of Star Wars drove him insane. I'm telling you, human minds are not made to handle this level of success. Stardom and being painted into a corner where you can no longer be a human in the ways that we just think of humanity existing will fuck a person up every time out. And the bigger it is and the more they get deified, the worse it's going to affect them.
Okay, so real quick, I found this in my notes. Title change to Star Wars. First happened when re-released in July 1978, or some say as late as April 10th, 1981.
I like that we don't know for sure. That's interesting. You know what I mean?
Since
there's no internet and there's nobody to write it down or even really pay that close attention to it at the time. But yeah, no, I think the guy is already kind of crazy and was driven more crazy by the whole situation.
Much like with our Valiant episode and the Charlton Comics episode, I mean, this is by no means a definitive episode on Star Wars. You could go on about this shit all day.
Yeah.
But something I thought was interesting that when I was looking into all these changes, and again, the 10 changes are just for the first Star Wars film alone.
Right.
All of them have been altered.
Right, sure.
By this point.
Yeah.
Beginning in beginning in 78 and going all the way up to 2015 with the Blu-ray release.
The best thing that could have happened for George Lucas would have been for Star Wars to have been roughly as big of a hit as Planet of the Apes. And just a movie that geeks are into. It was monumental for people that are interested in that particular genre of entertainment, instead of it being this huge across-the-board thing. And that wasn't even his intention. He wanted it to be something that if you grew up watching Flash Gordon, you would see this movie and think it was cool. That was his plan. It wasn't for it to become a new religion.
I said that the last changes were made in 2015 to the Blu-ray release. I was mistaken. The Blu-ray was released in 2011. It was when it was released digitally in 2015, which is essentially the Blu-ray cut.
Right.
But there's changes to those too.
Yeah.
So he just couldn't let it go.
He couldn't. I have the despecialized edition.
That is the only version that I own. Are you talking about the
Yes.
DVD?
The Blu-ray, actually. The despecialized edition.
How did you get a hold of that?
It's out there, man. That dude, a guy named Harmy, right? Like a guy who teaches English to kids in Switzerland. I think it's Switzerland. Made that thing, and now he works in Hollywood as a result of that.
So that's interesting. And you'd mentioned earlier about the Phantom edit. There's Star Wars films that exist online, and I mean it's all of that is fascinating in itself.
I saw a thing once where the guy who writes Saga said, "Wouldn't it be great if everybody who is disappointed by the prequels just tried to make their own thing?" And that's what I am personally doing. I made I do that Ben Venice thing, which is basically if I got to write Nick Fury, it would be what Ben Venice is.
So here's the version that I own. In 2006, another version of the DVD edition was released. An unaltered version of the trilogy was included on bonus disc.
Okay, yeah, that's something else.
It was the same as the 1993 Laserdisc release and was inferior quality to the restored version.
Once I got a nice big TV, that one no longer scratched the itch. And it's got a lot of motion blur. Mm-hmm. So there's a thing called the despecialized edition where this guy got the Blu-ray.
And this is illegal.
Totally illegal. And he remade it. If you go on eBay, you can get it. Or you can maybe download it someplace if you do that.
Yeah. During this looking into these changes and stuff, I thought this was fascinating, and I don't know if you know this. I didn't know this. Bear with me a minute. So the 1977 release of Star Wars was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry of the United States Library of Congress in 1989. In 2014, the National Film Registry still did not have a copy of the 1977 film. Lucas refused to submit a copy, stating that he no longer authorized the release of the theatrical version.
Yep.
Lucasfilm offered the altered 1997 special edition release, but the registry refused it.
Yep. That's true.
Good for them.
True, yeah. Well, and there's a lot of people who worked on the special effects. There's a lot of people, they won an Academy Award for editing, right? And transversely, he's a guy who's obsessed with the restoration and continued value of other people's films.
For example?
Any other film. Like, that was a big thing for him. Like Ben-Hur. Like, there was a bunch of different movies that he championed preserving. Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, I mean, that's something that I think has always been cool about Criterion. I don't know if you have ever watched any releases from Criterion, but that is part of that is really their mission, is to restore, and re-release.
Right. So since he won't do it, and since Disney probably can't do it.
Well, and this is where this is just more legal, more just legal mumbo jumbo. But I want to say, a friend at the store was saying the other night that there may be an opening now for Disney to finally release the original theatrical version because of Fox.
They'll have to do it without Lucas's consent. So it's a huge fuck you to Lucas if they want to go through with it. But here's the thing. I don't give a fuck anymore because I have my despecialized edition. And I enjoy the fact that another fan who is way more psychotic about this than I am made it for me. So I have it. And I like the idea of the elements of fandom banding together to make this sort of stuff right. Yeah. I like that more, right? And in the same token, when I look at like the first Kenner action figure of Obi-Wan Kenobi, it doesn't look anything like Alec Guinness. It's very off-model, right? The colors are weird. All this stuff was off-model. But to me, those are the characters more than the guys in the movie. because that's what was important to me growing up.
Sure.
So my friend Dave Conover is a very good friend of mine. Had a great quote where he said, he's older than both of us, and he said, as he gets older, he finds that he mainly collects himself. When he wants to get some sort of a thing, it usually has to do with something that meant something to him as a kid or somewhere along the path of his journey. And it wasn't so much just about that. So to kind of get towards wrapping this thing up, I'll tell you about something that Alec Guinness once said that has come to mean a lot to me. This was in one of his books, and he talked about how there was a situation where a kid came up to him with his mom, and the kid said, "I've seen Star Wars 100 times, and I want your autograph. Can I have your autograph?" And Alec Guinness said, "I will give you my autograph if you promise me to never watch Star Wars again." And the kid started crying, and his mom yelled at him. He said, "How dare you do that?" And he said, "Perhaps it wasn't nice of me to do that, but I hope that child, now in his 30s, has overgrown childish secondhand banalities."
Let's get cynical.
Let's get cynical. You got anything to add?
No.
All right, let's never talk about Star Wars again. Thanks. Good night.
Later.